Oberleutnant Karl Hessler was one of the Reich's best fighter pilots, certain America was a soft, corrupted enemy. But when he was captured and taken deep into the desert, the terrifying truth that shattered his confidence wasn't a secret weapon, but the silent, unstoppable machine of American industry run entirely by thousands of women. The parachute ride down had been a blur of freezing air and flapping fabric, but the landing was a shock that left Oberleutnant Karl Hessler stunned on the unfamiliar soil. A decorated fighter pilot from the famed Jagdgeschwader II, Karl had soared above the chaos of Normandy, believing himself part of the technologically and morally superior force. He had been taught that his captors would be savages, but the first thing he registered was not malice, but paperwork. As the trucks delivered Karl and his fellow prisoners to a holding facility deep in the American Southwest, he braced for the shouting, the blows, the iron cage of true captivity. Instead, guards, dressed in neat olive drab, spoke in measured, non-threatening tones. They processed the men efficiently, recording personal details on clean white forms. Karl squinted in disbelief at the orderly rows of wooden barracks. The air, crisp and dry, smelled of pine and fresh paint, not stale sweat or fear. The quiet bureaucracy was more disarming than any physical threat would have been. It suggested an enemy too powerful to waste energy on cruelty. This calm, professional efficiency was perhaps the greatest immediate offense to Karl's indoctrinated mind. This American procedure, calm and almost effortless, felt like a deliberate insult. A soft mockery of the fear he had been trained to anticipate. When he was issued a standard, if temporary uniform and assigned a bunk, the shock deepened. He examined the bed, a clean mattress, 2 thick blankets, and a pillow. Back home, even seasoned soldiers faced shortages. Yet here, the enemy was providing comfort with apparent ease. He felt the absence of hate, which felt far more dangerous than the presence of anger. That evening, the mess hall offered a simple warm meal of stew, bread, and coffee, basic perhaps, but plentiful. Karl refused to eat, convinced the apparent bounty was a trick, a perverse form of psychological warfare. He watched his comrades hungrily devour the food, whispering that this was merely the prelude to their suffering. He clung to his conviction that America was fundamentally weak, its confidence a fragile facade. He reasoned that this soft environment was simply a logistical necessity for a nation too complacent to truly hate its enemies. His fear was slowly replaced by a growing, unsettling confusion that gnawed at the edges of his Nazi ideology. He knew that this strange, sterile prison was only a temporary holding pen. The real humiliation, the hard labor, and the eventual dismantling of his pride must lie further inland, far from the eyes of the coast. He waited in rigid, defiant silence, believing this temporary respite would end the moment he stepped deeper into the vast, unknown heart of the American industrial empire. The train carriages were old, repurposed boxcars, cramped and hot, but they were headed deeper into the American heartland, carrying Karl Hessler and 50 other German prisoners toward their unknown fate. Nothing had prepared him for the visual shock of scale that unfolded outside the narrow, barred windows. The vastness was almost frightening, an emptiness full of potential. For 2 days, the train rattled westward, and the scenery shifted from the sharp peaks of mountains to an impossibly flat, endless ocean of land. Karl watched the telephone poles blur past, counting them until the effort became meaningless. He saw wheat fields so vast, they looked like a single, massive golden carpet stretching to meet the horizon. In Germany, every inch of ground was meticulously planned. Here, the land seemed to obey no human boundary, mocking the very concept of limits. This was not just a country, it was a continent, unburdened by ancient walls or feuds. The light itself seemed different, wider, bolder, illuminating the colossal capacity of the soil. The propaganda had painted America as a brittle, over-mechanized nation of factory slaves. But the landscape outside refuted that lie with silent, overwhelming authority. This nation held a vastness, of space, of resources, of sheer, unimaginable logistical might that his mind struggled to process. He was looking at the bedrock of industrial capacity, the raw, unstinting wealth of a world power that felt less like an empire and more like a force of nature. He observed the sheer energy and space available, which allowed for a military effort of an entirely different dimension. One evening, as the sun dipped, staining the plains a furious orange, the train stopped on a desolate siding. Karl peered out, catching sight of a supply chain in motion. An endless ribbon of freight cars loaded not with tanks or guns, but with coal, timber, and oil, raw materials in quantities that defied German logistics. He, the celebrated pilot, knew the Reich was constantly fighting for the last reserves of fuel and metal. Here, the resources flowed with the casual abundance of a river. He calculated the cubic meters of lumber and tons of coal moving past, a logistical triumph that dwarfed the efforts of the entire German railway system. He whispered to the prisoner next to him, a former tank gunner. "They do not hoard. They waste because they have too much." The tank gunner simply nodded, his eyes wide and vacant. This wastage, this visible, almost reckless abundance, was a power Karl had never conceived. It suggested a confidence so complete it didn't need to fear depletion. He realized then that the war was not merely a series of battles. It was a race between German organization, honed by scarcity, and American production, fueled by an ocean of material wealth. Finally, the train slowed for the last time. The air grew still and hot, smelling faintly of dry earth and machinery. The windows framed a low, featureless scrubland, but beyond the dust, a massive, blocky silhouette rose into the twilight. It was the largest structure Karl had ever seen, a gargantuan complex of steel and concrete, humming with a continuous, palpable power. He knew immediately that he had arrived at the true center of the conflict. This was not a soft prison. It was the quiet, churning engine room of the enemy. And he was about to be put to work right outside its walls. The air at this new location was hot and smelled of aluminum dust and machine oil, a strangely industrial perfume that was familiar, yet unsettling. Karl Hessler stepped down from the truck, squinting at the barbed wire perimeter. It felt temporary, almost perfunctory. The prisoners had arrived at a new camp, a cluster of low, identical barracks nestled beside the largest manufacturing plant Karl had ever witnessed. It was here that Karl met Sergeant Miller, the man assigned to his detail almost immediately after disembarking. Miller was lean, middle-aged, and possessed a quiet, professional authority. He spoke in a soft southern drawl, treating the prisoners not as objects of hate, but as temporary labor assets. His voice carried the slow, dry rhythm of the American Southwest, utterly lacking the aggressive bark of a German officer. "You men are here to work," Miller stated plainly, leaning against a pickup truck that looked brand new. "If you follow the rules, you'll eat well. We need hands for the logistics around the factory perimeter. Can't expect our own boys to do everything when they're fighting overseas." Karl found this nonchalance maddening. Where was the necessary fury of war? He could only conclude that this calm was born of a dangerous lack of seriousness. Miller continued, "Fact is, we're short on labor. Got a lot of good people in there keeping this whole thing running, but it's a manpower problem, you might say. You fellas will ease the burden." The mention of the manpower problem and the people in there sparked a tiny nagging flicker of curiosity in Karl's mind. He still believed the factory was manned by a few aging supervisors, but Miller's casual hint suggested something more was at play. The sergeant's tone indicated the work was crucial, yet the mood was strangely relaxed. The prisoner's assignment was to clear and organize raw materials and scrap metal just outside the main facility's outer fence. Karl's pride flared at the mundane nature of the task. He was an officer, a skilled pilot, reduced to moving piles of dented sheet metal. Yet, the proximity was inescapable. The unmistakable hum of thousands of electric motors, the rhythmic clanging of hammers, and the piercing whine of cutting tools formed a continuous, overwhelming mechanical symphony. The noise was disciplined, enormous, and ceaseless, a sound of massive, coordinated purpose. Sergeant Miller tossed Karl a pair of thick, leather work gloves. "You'll be moving some heavy stuff out there," Miller said, pointing toward a stack of massive, nearly finished wing sections waiting on dollies. "Get started. Shift change is at 4 o'clock. Karl looked at the massive wings. He put on the gloves, the soft leather a final, subtle symbol of the enemy's strange, confusing comfort. The real confrontation, he knew, was not with the guards, but with the unseen power generating that endless, hypnotic hum. The sun was beginning its slow arc toward the western horizon when the siren cut through the hot, dry air. It was a high-pitched, sustained wail signaling the end of the shift inside the massive plant. Karl Hessler watched the main gates, expecting to see a trickle of old men or exhausted soldiers. He was prepared to feel contempt for the perceived weakness of the American labor pool. Instead of a trickle, a torrent of humanity began to pour forth, a sight that instantly froze the German prisoners near the fence line. It was not a torrent of men, but of women, thousands of them, moving with overwhelming speed and purpose. They were dressed in practical denim overalls or simple factory uniforms, their hair often tied back with scarves. They were young women, middle-aged women, and even some grandmothers. The shock was so acute it felt like a punch to the gut. The women looked capable, strong, and completely at home in their industrial roles. The volume was staggering. Karl had never witnessed such a massive civilian workforce dedicated to purely industrial production. They laughed, they chatted, they punched time cards and hurried toward the parking lots, a scene of utterly normal, confident departure. This was not coerced labor. This was a paid workforce, empowered and essential. This civilian tide was a tidal wave of American national will. The German worldview instantly buckled under the weight of this observable fact. In his memory, propaganda posters flashed, images of the ideal German woman dedicated solely to Kinder, Kirche, Küche, children, church, and kitchen. But the scale of this tide proved otherwise. Karl's calculations, even his core beliefs, suddenly felt ludicrously small. He realized that his entire belief about the Reich's industrial advantage had rested on a catastrophic assumption about America's social commitment. The women climbed into their own cars, sedans, battered coupes, and some riding bicycles, filling the vast parking area until the scene became a dizzying kaleidoscope of motion and sound. This entire humming engine of war was being powered by people his society had told him were incapable of operating complex machinery. Sergeant Miller, resting against the fence, noticed Karl's wide-eyed shock. He offered no lecture, just a casual observation. "They'll be back at 7 sharp tomorrow," Miller drawled. "Need to get those planes to the Pacific, you know. They don't miss a beat." Karl could only stare at the shrinking crowd, trying to reconcile the laughing women with the official image of the enemy. The total commitment of the American nation, a commitment that utilized every available person regardless of gender and powered them with its vast resources, was suddenly, terrifyingly visible. It was a power that felt less like a temporary military effort and more like a permanent, unrelenting force of national will. This revelation, delivered not by a bomb but by a stream of homebound workers, was the first concrete sign that the war he knew was already lost. If the story of Karl Hessler's stunning realization changed how you think about history, hit the like button so more people can uncover this lost moment. And don't forget to subscribe. We'll be back next week with another unbelievable story of courage and surprise from the heart of the war. The next morning, Karl Hessler told himself the previous day's sight had been an exception. He was determined to regain the intellectual high ground. Sergeant Miller, seemingly anticipating this internal argument, announced a change in the prisoner's assignment. Today, "You gentlemen are going to help clean up the assembly staging area," Miller said, pointing toward a stretch of concrete just 50 feet from the massive hangar bay doors. "Watch your step. Don't touch anything." This proximity granted Karl an unprecedented, terrifying view into the heart of the enemy's war machine. The smell of oil and welding flux was now sharp and immediate. The air was thick with the honest scent of work and the sound of heavy metal being shaped. The scene inside the open hangar was beyond anything Karl had imagined. It was a vast, chaotic universe of metal, wires, and tools. Yet, within that chaos, there was undeniable motion. He saw incomplete bomber fuselages, aircraft massive enough to carry the war across oceans, being wheeled past, and everywhere, working with disciplined focus, were the women. Karl watched a young woman, perhaps only 19, operating a massive overhead crane with smooth, practiced movements, carefully lowering a 40-foot wing section onto a jig. He saw another, her face partially obscured by a protective shield, deftly running a welding torch along a pressurized bulkhead, the blue light flashing with professional competence. These were structural, high-stakes jobs requiring mathematical precision and physical strength. They wore protective goggles and handled equipment that required not just muscle, but deep technical knowledge of stress points and alloy tolerances. Yet, these American women handled heavy-duty riveting guns and hydraulic presses with the practiced ease of experts. One woman, her brow furrowed in concentration, was perched precariously on a scaffold, tightening a complex series of bolts on a landing gear strut, a component Karl knew had to withstand phenomenal forces. Karl observed their demeanor. They moved with the quiet, methodical confidence of experts. They laughed with each other during short breaks, then instantly returned to a state of focused, productive silence. The realization struck Karl like a sudden downdraft. This was not desperate substitute labor. This was a well-trained, disciplined, and massive workforce that had mastered the complexity of modern warfare production. His internal narrative was crumbling, riveted by the sight of these focused women. As the morning progressed, every clang of metal, every whir of machinery seemed to mock Karl's former certainty. He realized the problem was not American lack of skill, but American abundance of confidence, a confidence so vast they never doubted that an entire generation of women could step into the breach and master the intricacies of aviation engineering. This social flexibility gave America an industrial depth the rigid Reich could never achieve. Did you know America's wartime propaganda deliberately hid the sheer number of women builders from the enemy? Let us know in the comments below what shocked you the most about the scale of America's war effort. The work was exhausting, but for Karl Hessler, the fatigue of manual labor was nothing compared to the mental arithmetic that began to consume his mind. He was a pilot, accustomed to calculating, and now he was forced to calculate something far more terrifying, the scale of his enemy's output. From his vantage point, Karl could see the continuous flow of the assembly line. It wasn't a frantic pace, but a smooth, relentless rhythm, like a conveyor belt carrying the fate of nations. Every few hours, a completed 4-engine bomber was towed out of the hangar doors and onto the testing tarmac. He began to count them, first consciously, then pathologically, tallying the numbers against the dwindling output he remembered from German factories. His internal ledger was bleeding red, a catastrophic accounting of industrial capacity. The planes were so immense they seemed to mock the idea of scarcity. Here, Karl saw mountains of unused scrap, parts discarded merely for minor blemishes. The ease with which the materials flowed, aluminum sheeting, wiring harnesses, massive tires, spoke of a logistical pipeline that was overflowing, not rationing. He realized this factory was not merely supplying the war, it was drowning the enemy in sheer material. He calculated that this single, colossal factory, run largely by the confident women, was producing more new aircraft in 1 week than the combined efforts of his entire Air Wing suppliers could manage in an entire month. He had been told that American democracy was inefficient, yet the engine of production here ran with a quiet, overwhelming consistency that no totalitarian rhetoric could replicate. The noise was the sound of a nation succeeding effortlessly. Karl watched a team of 4 women effortlessly manipulate a large wing flap into position. They used a small, electrically powered winch designed specifically for the task. It wasn't brute force that mattered here, but innovative design paired with a unified will. This was a machine designed to create an unending storm of material that would crush any foe through sheer, unyielding volume. The final, shattering blow to his conviction came from the moral comparison inherent in the work. In Germany, women were implored to endure, motivated by the fear of defeat. Their labor was a compelled duty. Here, there was focused patriotism, not fear. The United States was fighting the war with its comforts, not despite them. He saw the whole society was dedicated to production, an entire nation unified without the need for the brutal force of the Gestapo. He thought of the pilots and maintenance crews back home, constantly fighting for fuel and parts. Here, the solution to damage or loss was immediate replacement. The American approach was simply more. More planes, more parts, more people, flowing in a torrent that showed no sign of receding. His arrogance dissolved into the scorching truth of this industrial reality. The intellectual surrender had been made, but the emotional truth required one final, simple observation. Karl watched one woman, the same older woman he had seen earlier, tending to a minor maintenance issue on a massive, complex radial engine before it was fitted into a fuselage. She was not performing heavy labor, but a precise, final safety check. She reached into the tangle of piping and wiring, her hand finding a single, slightly loose clamp deep within the engine housing. Without drama or seeking help, she pulled out a specialized wrench, a tool that looked delicate but perfectly calibrated, and tightened the clamp with a single, crisp motion. She signed her inspection tag, tapped the housing twice with the wrench, and moved on. The entire operation took less than 30 seconds, flawless and self-assured. This was the antithesis of the fear-driven German system. This was the calm, patriotic effort of a civilian who simply understood her role. Her small, perfect action, completed without supervision, demonstrated a deep level of trust and competence that surpassed all the propaganda. It wasn't the sheer scale that mattered in that moment. It was the micro-detail, the profound, simple confidence of that single, focused, tightening motion. This unassuming woman was the embodiment of the nation's total commitment, a human pillar of its industrial might. He looked around at the vast hangar, realizing the problem was not American lack of skill, but American abundance of moral confidence, a belief in their own system that allowed them to treat their captives with decency and mobilize their citizens with trust. This trust, he realized, was a source of limitless power. His entire world narrowed to the sight of that woman's retreating back, a symbol of the immense, self-assured nation he had foolishly underestimated. He saw that the foundation of victory was not the Nazi salute, but the quiet, honest work of millions of free individuals. The sun cast long, molten shadows across the tarmac, painting the colossal factory in hues of orange and deepening purple. Karl Hessler sat alone on an overturned crate during the final break, the noise of the machinery finally silenced for the night. The exhaustion he felt was profound, a total intellectual surrender. The silence itself felt heavy, weighted by the sheer number of planes that had been built in that single day. He knew he needed to speak the truth aloud. He waited until Sergeant Miller walked the fence line, conducting his routine evening check. Karl stood and approached the wire slowly, meeting the guard's gaze. Miller, sensing the change in the pilot's posture, stopped, resting his rifle butt lightly on the ground. "Sergeant," Karl began, his German accent heavy, his voice low, "I have been watching this place for 8 days. I have been counting. I have seen your people." Miller waited patiently, offering no verbal cue. Karl felt the shame, the collapse of his lifelong certainty, but he pushed the words forward. "I flew for the Reich, believing we had the better engineers, the better will. Our radio told us your country was weak, its people soft. But I was wrong." He gestured with an open hand toward the massive dark hangar, its bulk looming over them. "In my country, we build aircraft piece by piece. We use our women out of desperation. Here, your women build these bombers with a calm confidence that requires no shouting or threat." Karl paused, sucking in a long, dusty breath of the desert air. He waited for the sergeant to gloat, to confirm his humiliation. Miller's gaze remained steady. He simply adjusted the brim of his hat. "We figure, son, if you need a job done, you find the best person to do it. And if that's Miss Betty running a rivet gun, then that's Miss Betty. It doesn't matter much who it is as long as the job gets done right." Karl's shoulders slumped. He had expected a lecture. Instead, he got practical, simple, devastating American pragmatism. He looked the sergeant squarely in the eye, finally admitting the truth. "The war is lost," Karl whispered, the full weight of the statement settling between them. "Not in the field, Sergeant. It is lost here, on this floor, because of this silent, unstoppable machine built by your women. Miller nodded once, a solemn, understated acceptance of fact. His lack of triumph was the final measure of American confidence. This realization was the greatest intellectual defeat Karl Hessler would ever face. That moment shattered the pilot's arrogance and proved the profound, quiet strength of the American home front. Share this video with a friend to show them the true cost of underestimating an enemy. April of 1945 brought a change in the desert air, the faint, unsettling aroma of things coming to an end. The war still raged, yet at Camp 6, the tension that had held Karl Hessler rigid for months began to slacken. The news traveling slowly across the Atlantic confirmed the inevitability he had witnessed on the tarmac months before. Karl was observant, his mind transformed from that of a prisoner to a profound, if unwilling, student of the enemy society. His initial hatred had been replaced by a quiet, consuming sense of intellectual awe for the sheer magnitude of the American effort. He found himself looking forward to the shift changes now with an odd, nascent respect. He noticed the subtleties of the women's interactions, the quick shared jokes, the easy camaraderie, the way they celebrated a completed wing section. They worked not for the glory of a single leader, but for the quiet, shared purpose of bringing their sons and brothers home. They were fighting the war with hammers and wrenches, driven by love, not decree. During one afternoon break, a group of women offered the German prisoners cigarettes and chewing gum. This was a direct violation of the rules, yet the gesture was delivered with such simple, matter-of-fact humanity. When Karl hesitated, one woman, whose face was smudged with grease, simply smiled and said, "It's almost over, isn't it? We just won our boys back." The phrase resonated in Karl's mind. The small offerings were powerful acts of common humanity that broke down the walls of ideology. He began to write home, to the censored channels. His letters focused on the unbelievable productivity of the California landscape. He described the relentless, organized flow of the factory floor, making special mention of the women engineers who handled the complex airframes. He tried to articulate the idea that America's strength came not from its military officers, but from the combined, quiet, and profound commitment of its entire civilian population. The message he sent was clear. The truth of America was the opposite of the propaganda. He was beginning to understand that the greatest weapon was their moral confidence, the belief in their own system that allowed them to treat their captives with decency. This trust, he realized, was a source of limitless power. Karl knew his life as a captured pilot was ending, but his journey as an ambassador of reality was just beginning. He would return home armed not with weapons, but with the painful, undeniable truth of what he had witnessed on the tarmac. A truth that would serve to dismantle the foundations of fear and dogma that had led his nation to ruin. The day the orders came for repatriation was not marked by cheering, but by a solemn, bone-deep silence. Karl Hessler stood with his few possessions. The only thing he truly carried was the memory of the factory, as the familiar American trucks arrived to take the men back to the coast for the long journey home. He took one last, long look at the vast, windowless assembly plant, now quiet, its production paused, a monument to the industrial confidence that had sealed Germany's fate. The sight would be his lasting symbol of both defeat and enlightenment. As he boarded the truck, Karl saw Sergeant Miller approach the fence one last time. The guard handed him a small sealed paper bag containing travel rations. "Good luck, pilot," Miller said simply. "Maybe next time you won't need to fly so far to see the world." Karl nodded, accepting the simple mercy. He left America burdened by an essential, painful truth. He stepped onto the truck no longer as a loyal officer, but as a man searching for a new path. The journey home took months. When his ship finally reached Bremerhaven, the sight was devastating. A homeland reduced to rubble and ash, cold and gray, a physical representation of the defeat he had already processed mentally. The knowledge he carried of American decency and competence was the only thing the rubble could not swallow. He knew the only way forward was to rebuild with the efficiency and social trust he had seen firsthand. Karl secured a job as a translator for the Allied occupation forces. He was unique, among his countrymen. When German civilians asked him about America, he described the clean barracks, the endless coffee, and the terrifying, beautiful sight of women building bombers. He told them of the effortless efficiency that made German organizations seem frantic. He spoke of the simple principle Sergeant Miller had imparted, finding the best person for the job. This experience ultimately defined his post-war life. The Air Force was gone, but the love of precision engineering remained. In 1952, Karl opened a small practical trade school in his rebuilt city, teaching basic metallurgy, electrical wiring, and tool and die work. His school was founded on two principles. Technical mastery is necessary for survival, and true strength comes from the total commitment and dignity of every single worker. He instilled in his students the democratic principles of merit and collective effort he learned watching the female workforce. He never forgot the sight of the women on the factory floor. He lived out his years as a testament to the power of a single observation, forever proving that sometimes the most important lessons of war are learned far from the front lines, quietly, on a sun-drenched tarmac. If the story of Karl Hessler's stunning realization changed how you think about history, hit the like button so more people can uncover this lost moment. And don't forget to subscribe. We'll be back next week with another unbelievable story of courage and surprise from the heart of the war.